To his destination, Nick traveled for almost 3 hours by commuter train. Behind him was his beloved college dorm, and ahead lay his teaching internship. It so happened that Nick was assigned to a remote little village with the peculiar name of Bear Creek. Whether there were any actual bears there, the young teacher didn't know, but he was certain it was in the middle of nowhere. Nick was pretty loyal toward the locals. He'd often visited his grandpa Walter as a kid and helped out with the beehives. Those were good times. Lost in thought, Nick closed his eyes and, leaning back against the hard seat, smiled simply. But he didn't get to enjoy his memories for long. Soon, a gloomy-looking conductor named Fred approached and told him the next stop was his. Noticing Nick's large bag and a school globe in a special case, he muttered under his breath, "You shouldn't go there, kid. Bear Creek is pure wilderness. The last teacher before you ran away from the village at night in nothing but his underwear, and it was freezing cold. He didn't make it 100 yards to the station, froze to death. Where he was running, only God knows." Nick squinted at the conductor, wondering if he was joking or just spinning tall tales for a gullible audience. "I'm not the scared type, sir, so I'm not running out naked. And if I do, it's warm now," Nick replied. The conductor just shook his head and didn't argue. Getting off at the old, urine-scented station, Nick slung his bag over his shoulder and trudged toward the village. He had at least 2 miles to walk. It was a fine summer evening, the copper disk of the sun slowly sinking toward the horizon. The air was sharp with the scent of pine needles and wildflowers, which made Nick's head spin a little. On both sides of the road, dense mixed forest grew, and the sound of birdsong drifted from somewhere nearby. Nick smiled and picked up the pace. He reached the village at dusk, staggering from exhaustion. He looked at the low, one-story building with a tiled roof, now green with moss from the woods. As it turned out, Nick was expected. The principal of the school, who was also the head of the township, had already been notified of his arrival. The short, chubby man with a fawning look extended his plump hand. "Anthony S. Riker, and you must be Nick?" "Nick Alexander," the young intern corrected him, trying to sound important. The principal nodded, then sadly added, "Nick Alexander, here's the thing. It's already night, and there's no free housing in the village." "Well, there is, but we'll find you something tomorrow morning. For now, you'll have to spend the night in this building." Nick raised his eyebrows in surprise. "You mean the school?" "Sure, why not? Dinner's already waiting for you in the cafeteria. Soup, a main course, and some juice," Nick replied with a hint of irony. The principal appreciated the joke and smiled. "Well, we could rustle up something stronger too. Some moonshine, for example. After a long trip, it's just the thing. Old Lady Gladys makes a good batch, steeped with sage. Drink that and—" "Enough," Nick interrupted. "No moonshine for me. I'd rather wash up first, then think about food." Anthony S. nodded in agreement, and promising to arrange everything, opened the doors to the old school. Honestly, Nick didn't expect much. Whitewashed walls, creaky wooden floors, and curtains so dirty you could probably make soup out of them. The chubby principal briskly led Nick to the cafeteria, a stuffy little room with greasy, soot-covered pots on the stove that hadn't been cleaned in ages. In the corner stood a table with a rather questionable meal. Mashed potatoes with a patty that looked like a dog's old chew toy, and a sweating glass of juice from the fridge. Well, that's what we've got. We're always short on teachers, and we've never had a geography teacher, the principal said, wiping sweat from his brow. And probably never will, Nick thought, but he kept quiet and gratefully collapsed into a chair. That's that then, the principal said, checking his watch. I'll go to bed. You can sleep in the gym on the mats. There's a shower right there, like a luxury suite, right? Nick mumbled something unintelligible and cautiously sipped the juice from his glass. Nick Alexander, the principal called from the doorway. You're not, by any chance, baptized? What do you mean? Nick asked, surprised. Well, do you wear a cross around your neck? I do. Why does it matter? The principal grinned oddly and replied quietly. Oh, nothing. Just making conversation. Nick smiled, but didn't dwell on the local quirks. What do you expect from a small-town guy whose only thoughts are moonshine and food? Nick wasn't very hungry, so he just poked at the mashed potatoes for show and set the plate aside. The clock showed 11:15. Time was flying, and he still needed a shower before bed. He couldn't show up to students reeking like a dead goat. Grabbing his towel and toiletries, Nick left the kitchen and walked down the dimly lit hallway. The old floorboards creaked underfoot, as if there was a bottomless pit beneath them. The ceiling bulb was so weak, Nick had to strain his eyes not to miss the door to the gym and the shower room. Always saving money, screwing in some useless bulb, Nick muttered, pulling the door open. A wave of damp and rotten wood hit him. He felt around for the switch. Lights flickered twice, then went out. Nick pulled out his phone, hoping the shower would at least have working lights. Turning on the flashlight, he headed to the back of the gym, where the principal said the showers were. The old wooden floor groaned beneath him like a sinner in an inquisitor's dungeon. Glancing nervously around, Nick cursed himself for deciding to shower in the middle of the night, while the long shadows of gym equipment loomed on both sides like some otherworldly, malevolent presence from a nightmare. To Nick's relief, there was electricity in the shower room. The ceiling bulb was just as dim as the others in the hallway. Looking around warily, Nick started undressing. Stripped down to his boxers, he stepped into the shower stall and undressed completely. The stall door didn't work, so he used a rubber curtain. Not that he needed to close it. Who would he be afraid of in an empty school at this hour? As soon as the warm water hit his skin, Nick closed his eyes in bliss and started washing his hair. Maybe this is the real small-town pleasure, he thought. Suddenly, over the sound of water, Nick heard a strange noise, like muffled giggling. Goosebumps ran down his back. Standing naked behind a translucent curtain, he felt extremely vulnerable, especially since his clothes were outside the shower. The giggle came again, closer this time. Nick tensed, gripping the water control knob tightly, and asked clearly, "Hey, who's there?" No answer. Then came a squelching sound, and the water stopped. Apparently the tank was empty. Nick slammed his fist against the stall bushie and looked down in frustration at the last suds swirling down the drain. Near the drain, he noticed something odd. Squatting, Nick touched the floor and jerked his hand back. A clump of women's hair glistened at the bottom of the shower, looking like a pile of maggots feasting on a corpse. Grimacing in disgust, Nick bolted from the shower, grabbing his phone and underwear. It was cold outside the shower, and goosebumps ran down his back. When Nick turned on his flashlight, he was horrified to see his clothes were gone. Worse, a trail of small, wet footprints led away from where they'd been. "Hey, this isn't funny," Nick shouted, hurriedly pulling on his boxers. At that moment, something rough and slimy brushed his ankle. Nick jumped back with a yell and shone his light in that direction, but no one was there. Just a strange, wet spot on the floor. "Stop it! Why are you doing this?" Nick asked, his voice lower now. A disgusting giggle answered him, almost right by his ear. The young intern screamed again, waving his arms like a windmill, but it did no good. Nick was still alone in the gym, in his boxers, with his phone's flashlight growing dimmer by the second. He was shaking, snot running from his nose. Just then, one of the basketballs in the bin suddenly fell to the floor and slowly rolled toward his feet. Nick stopped it with his bare foot, smearing something sticky on his sole. He bent down and recoiled as if he'd touched a bomb. Written on the ball, apparently in fresh blood, were the words, "You will die soon." "No, that can't be. It's just paint. Regular watercolor, damn it." Nick read, knowing full well he couldn't fool himself. Especially as shuffling footsteps sounded from the darkness, like someone slapping their bare feet on the floor. Nick's lips trembled as he shone the light toward the sound, and recoiled in horror. Walking toward him was a dead woman, her gray hair streaming to her shoulders, wearing a wet dress crawling with maggots. Nick froze in terror, not knowing what to do or where to run. The corpse blocked his way, arms outstretched as if to hug him tight. Suddenly, more shuffling came from the opposite corner. Nick looked over. His heart thudded. Another corpse. This time a man in a tracksuit, battered sneakers, oozing pus and blood, shuffled toward him. "Oh God, what is this?" Nick yelled as another figure emerged from the darkness. A woman with a short haircut, her skull gleaming with worms. Nick backed into the shower, knowing he couldn't fight off the undead. More and more corpses appeared, dressed in what used to be formal, now rotting. Clothes, a truly nightmarish sight. Soon, Nick realized he was facing almost the entire former teaching staff, dead for years, crawling out from every corner, reaching for him with twisted fingers. At some point, Nick's cross grew red-hot, burning his skin. The ghouls drew closer, and he frantically searched the shower for an exit. Finally, he spotted a small window high up near the ceiling, once used as a vent. With no other choice, Nick jumped and smashed the glass with his hand. Blood gushed from his cut palm as the dead teachers behind him snarled and lunged, licking up the drops. Nick hung from the window, wriggling like a caterpillar, and managed to pull himself halfway through. Shards of glass cut his skin, but he didn't care. The undead teachers were snarling and clawing at the wall behind him. Falling out into a storage room, Nick ran blindly, bumping into rusty buckets and broken mops. His body was covered in deep cuts, leaving a trail of blood. Finally, he made it to the hallway, the same one leading to the exit, past the kitchen he'd already seen. Bleeding, Nick used the last of his strength to rush to the door, but it was locked from the outside. "Let me out, please," Nick screamed. The answer was Anthony S. Riker's laughter. "Oh, you naive fool, you think I'll let you go? There haven't been any kids or adults in our village for years. I'm the caretaker here, and a former student of this school. Those nice folks chasing you, they're the teachers. Over the years, I dug up their graves and pulled their bodies from their coffins." "What? You're insane," Nick shouted. "That's not for you to judge, kid," the principal rasped through the door. "Get ready to be dinner for our staff. For years, as township head and principal of this abandoned school, I lured interns here. Who cares about our backwater if there haven't been kids here in ages, and only a couple of old folks left? I filed the right paperwork about a teacher shortage, and here you are, eager to spend the night in the school." "Why do you do this?" Nick whispered, pounding the door in despair. "Because for years I was bullied at school, and the teachers just watched and did nothing. Once my classmates even shoved my head in the school toilet. But I got my revenge, one by one. You don't know that I made a crypt under the gym floor. At night, I'd dig up a teacher or classmate and bring the body here. That's how I gathered the whole staff, one corpse at a time. They were all old. I outlived them all. Nick felt sick at the confession. Falling to his knees, he turned his back to the door and drew a protective circle with his own blood. After a moment's thought, he drew two more, though less perfect. Whether it would work, he didn't know, but he had no choice. At least his grandpa had told him about such things as a kid. Chalk would be better, of course, but where could he get any now? Soon the first corpses arrived, drawn by the scent of blood. Nick closed his eyes and began reciting prayers from memory, tears and blood streaming down his face. About an hour later, the decomposing vice principal crossed the first circle and dropped dead. Only the PE teacher made it through the second, worms pouring from his tracksuit. Despite Nick praying like a madman, the third circle was breached by the late principal, her exposed scalp sliding to the side like a clown wig. She was reaching for Nick's throat with bony fingers when the first rooster crowed in the village. Nick closed his eyes and passed out. The school doors burst open, and police officers appeared, guns drawn. It turned out the conductor, Fred, had called them, having long suspected something was wrong, but afraid to tell anyone. After arresting Anthony S. Riker, police tore up the gym floor and found over a dozen half-rotted coffins, former staff members, exhumed and disturbed by the former student. That same day, the remains were reburied in the cemetery and given last rites by a priest from the county. From that day on, Bear Creek officially ceased to exist, and the surviving old folks were relocated to other towns. The school was demolished, and Anthony S. Riker was committed to a psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. Once Nick recovered from his injuries and trauma, he returned to college, where he received his internship documents and a diploma with honors. Many envied the former student, not knowing what kind of nightmare he'd actually survived in that old country school